Hello, everyone. I'm Kristen Hunter from EXL Events, and on behalf of EXL and the Avoca Group, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on ICH E6 R2 requirements for vendor oversight. As many of you know, EXL and Avoca have an established partnership with a goal of providing the industry with valuable information through presentations at conferences, as well as webinars like this one. There are just a few technical things I'd like to address before we get things started. To the left of the slides, you should see a Q&A box. If you don't, click the Q&A on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen and it should appear. Use this Q&A box to submit questions at any time throughout the webinar. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can during allocated time after the presentation, but we have a ton of people on this webinar and it's likely that we won't be able to get to all of them. So if your question goes unanswered, someone from the Avoca Group will contact you following the webinar. I believe they compile the unanswered questions into a document and we'll be sending that around. To the left of the Q&A box and to the right of the presentation slides, you'll see a couple vertical banners for two related upcoming events. Our 4th European Clinical Quality Risk Management Summit, taking place February 24th and 25th in London, and our 11th Proactive GCP Compliance Conference on March 16th to 18th in Philadelphia. Both of these conferences feature presentations from the Avoca Group, and today's speaker, Bridget Flanagan, will actually be giving the presentation at next month's European event on effective vendor oversight plans. We are also offering an exclusive 25% discount off registration for that event for the first 20 people attending this webinar who register for next month's European conference using the discount code AVOCAWEB. You can click directly on either banner for more information about these events and to register. In that same Q&A box on the left side, you'll see a Speaker Bio tab, which provides more information on today's speaker, who is Bridget Flanagan, as I mentioned, and is a senior consultant at the Avoca Group. Bridget has more than 20 years of experience in clinical operations, including time at Fresenius Medical Care and the Biomedical Research Alliance of New York. The final tab in that Q&A box is for handouts. Here you'll be able to access several supporting documents provided by the Avoca Group. A few days after the webinar, you'll receive an email from the Avoca Group that will include the slides as well as some additional information. Feel free to respond to that email with any additional questions that you may have. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Kristen. Good morning and good afternoon to those of you who are on this side of the pond. I'm actually speaking to you from Ireland today. And before we start, I'm just going to give you a little overview on the Avoca Group in case you're not familiar with it. And then I'm going to continue on speaking about effective vendor oversight and how you might be measuring it and making some suggestions as to how you can do that. So if you're not familiar with the Avoca Group, I'll just let you know that we've been dedicated to improving quality and compliance in the clinical trial execution process for over 20 years. We do this by helping companies develop and implement quality and compliance standards throughout their organization. And whether it's through consulting, online learning, membership in our consortium, the Diligent Vendor Qualification Platform, or giving webinars like this, Avoca's mission is to help companies increase quality, ensure compliance, and improve efficiency so that medicines can reach patients faster. And this slide, which is quite a busy slide, actually shows the members of the Avoca Quality Consortium. It was established in 2011 with just a small handful of members, and today it's comprised of over 8,000 company representatives representing more than 100 member companies. You might want to check to see if your company name is listed. And if you see your company's name on the slide, but you don't know how to access the Knowledge Center, or if you don't see your company's name on the slide and want to learn about membership, please contact us after the webinar. So before we begin, I just want to learn a little bit about who my audience is today. So what type of organization are you with? pharma, biotech, medical device, CRO, or other. Okay, and it looks like we're pretty much evenly representing the pharma and the biotech group, and then we also have some CRO members and others who have identified as other. And then the next question, which department do you represent? Clinical operations, quality management, compliance, medical and scientific, or other? Okay, so it looks like we're pretty evenly divided between clinical operations and quality management, which is good. And the final question is, which time frame does your organization expect to be fully compliant with ICH E6 or 2? 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12. We are already compliant. Not sure, do not know. Okay, and as you can probably see there, it's quite a few of you actually. 50% are already compliant. 28% are not sure or do not know, and then 9% in the next 6 to 12 months, and 3 to 6 months, just 1%, and 0 to 3 months, 9%. So some of you, quite a significant proportion of you, are close, if not already compliant, and the remainder are not sure or do not know, which I would have to say is concerning. So ICH E6 or 2 has been in effect now for 3 years, and it was modernized to keep pace with the scale and complexity of clinical trials and to ensure the appropriate use of technology. It took 2 decades for that change to be implemented, but now the pace of change is happening more rapidly. Keep in mind, or you may not know, ICH E8 Revision 1, General Considerations for Clinical Studies, is expected to go into effect in or around June of this year. The public comment for that closed in November of 2019. And like E6 or 2, it calls for identifying factors that are critical to quality in the design stage, and then planning the study conduct proportionate to the risks to these quality factors, thereby protecting human subjects and ensuring the reliability of clinical study results. It also calls for consulting with patients and or patient organizations in the design, planning, and conduct of clinical studies, making sure that all their perspectives are captured. And then when E8 goes into effect, that will be followed by ICH E6 or 3, and that action was proposed and endorsed by ICH in November of 2019, and that's a full rewrite and reorganization of ICH E6 or 2. It'll retain the concept and guidance, but it's going to expand, modify, and reorganize the sections to provide scientific and ethical guidance that will enable a diversity of approaches that are relevant and adaptable to the various types of clinical trials designs and innovative technologies. So while E6 or 2 included a focus on proportionate risk-based approach to the design and conduct, E6 or 3 will be designed to further advance this concept and to encourage relevant parties to utilize this approach. And the common thread across all these revisions is a risk-based approach. So you really need to if you're close, or haven't even, aren't that close, for those of you, the 28% who didn't know, there's so many other changes coming that really it's time at this point to put R2 behind us, be ready, and then be ready with, get ready for E8 R1, which will be coming this summer. So then just looking at the changes that were made to the incorporated addendum, section 5 on quality management, it requires that you have a system to manage quality. And historically that was handled exclusively by QA, who very often did not get involved until there was a serious non-compliance at a site, or you were getting ready for submissions and you were anticipating what sites might get audited. However, now the expectation is from the get-go that quality is being managed through the life cycle of the study using a risk-based approach, focusing on risks to critical processes and data and issues that matter. You're also advised to avoid unnecessary complexity in procedures and data collection, and complex processes are inherently risky and pave the way to protocol deviations, as I'm sure you all know. So during protocol development, the sponsor should identify critical processes and data, then identify risks of those data, evaluate the risk, control it, communicate it to the relevant stakeholders, review them periodically during the course of the trial, and finally, in your clinical study report, you should describe your quality management approach, how you implemented it, and summarize important deviations from the predefined tolerance limits and the remedial actions that you took. When activities are outsourced, including duties and functions subcontracted to other parties by the CRO, the ultimate responsibility for quality and integrity of the trial data always resides with the sponsor who provides oversight. Sponsors utilize specialty vendor services such as central labs for critical data, for example, data that are critical to ensure human subject protection and or the reliability of trial results. For example, consider a false positive or a false negative of a biopsy result and the harm that that may pose for a patient and the reliability of the results. How would you control that risk in accordance with Section 5? Identifying risks to the quality of work performed by the CRO and other vendors allows the sponsor to actively manage those risks and reduce the likelihood of severe consequences. Then when the section on monitoring has been updated, just bear with me here, that is one activity that is generally outsourced, and it's one method to control risk. R2 gives you the flexibility in how you approach it, but you need to justify your rationale for the strategy you've chosen. At an FDA workshop last year, David Burrow, the director of the Office of Scientific Investigation at CEDAR, he said they strongly encourage approaches to monitoring that place quality front and center. Risk-based monitoring is one facet of a quality-based system designed to produce an absence of errors that matter, but unfortunately some view RBM as an end in itself rather than a tool within a holistic quality management system. Plus, what constitutes risk-based monitoring varies across organizations, and some try to fit the strategy on top of an already developed protocol. It has had some, good results. The Association of Clinical Research Organizations, ACRO, they published a paper at the end of last year which indicated that risk-based monitoring had improved overall clinical trial monitoring. They reported 28% fewer critical and major findings per clinical quality control visit and a 16% lower mean cost per monitoring visit. The MHRA, when they send out the inspection dossier before they come to inspect you, they ask whether there is a risk proportionate approach to monitoring and how is this applied. And then we also have the FDA Guidance for Industry issued in August of 2013, which suggests that sponsors should evaluate the monitoring reports and also have performance metrics. And then, if you're going to say you're going to do something, you need to do it. So, for example, who's going to review the reports of the sponsor? Do they have the required competencies? What qualifications do they have? If they don't have the required competencies, i.e., a seasoned CRA or a PM, that's a risk to consider. So when it comes to vendor oversight, and these are the items I'm going to speak to next, these are the ones you should consider. First of all, a governance structure, a clinical quality agreement, review of all documents. You want to prevent issues from arising rather than reacting. You're going to use available technology. There'll be real-time management of risk, and you're going to provide oversight commensurate with that risk. So we're going to start first of all with governance. It's a formal structure which is going to guide and manage the sponsor-CRO relationship. It can vary in complexity depending on the size of the organization, what's in the pipeline, etc. But you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If you're a member of Avoca, we have templates available that you can use for charters. And if you're working with a sponsor, small sponsor perhaps, working with a CRO, you can reach out to them and ask them what they've used in the past, what kind of template they have used. So don't reinvent the wheel. Ideally, you want people in your governance committee with the breadth of knowledge to address topics that come up and who can also help you identify other key strategic and functional members. You're going to establish processes for communication and issue escalation. And, you may decide that you'll need some subcommittees. For example, if it's a global study, you might have some subcommittees addressing issues that come up in different regions. You can start by doing an internal risk assessment. What is your organizational experience? Who has industry experience? What kind of experience do they have? I like to see a culture of right first time principles. It may be the first time working with a CRO and you want to set your expectations from the start. The next thing to do is to put a clinical quality agreement in place. And this actually is a quote from the Avoca template quality agreement. And such an agreement would just be one component of your quality management system. So other components you should consider are your policies and procedures, training, issue management and CAPAs, knowledge management, clinical risk management, inspections and audit management, and then KPIs, key performance indicators, and key quality indicators. So when you're evaluating proposals from the different CROs, look for information on their quality management systems and how they propose to manage risk. Operational and regulatory staff should know what has changed in the regulatory sphere, but business development people, they may not keep up, and proposal documents might not have been updated to reflect a commitment to a risk-based methodology. So if you have questions about a proposal you've received, do ask the CRO. I came across a story to tell here lately. Actually, last summer, a colleague that I was working with in the United States, and she was soliciting proposals from different CROs and asked me to review them. And one that I looked at, there was no mention of central monitoring or risk-based monitoring at all. It was your traditional, 1 to 2 visits every six weeks across all sites. So when I pointed this out to her that that the ICH E602 requirements now for central monitoring or strategy for your monitoring approach, and when she reached back to them and said, we don't see any risk-based monitoring in this proposal, and they said, well, you didn't ask for that. So that's just me. That's a vendor that isn't keeping up. Either their BD people or the vendor themselves are not up to date on what the new requirements are. So you also want to know whether you will have access to their SOPs. That is the expectation here in the EU. How will you know if they're following their SOPs unless you can check that? Will you see the training records? What about vendors who are subcontractors of the CRO? How often do they reevaluate them? How will they be overseeing them? How is that oversight documented? And then what is the process of issue escalation from vendor to CRO to sponsor? Any meetings should have an agenda. They should be minuted, as well as indicate who is responsible for action items. Meeting minute templates. Consider having a section on risk review, or to note that updates have been made to the Transalerate risk assessment and categorization tool, if that's what you're using, or you may be using your own customized version. Then where actions arise, it should be clear who the action has been assigned to and when it's due to be completed. Failure to implement an action could have detrimental effects, and this was seen in a serious breach reported to the MHRA where a packaging issue was not rectified, resulting in a subject taking an overdose of investigational product, which resulted in a fatality. So where status reports are received, it's important to know what to do with them, what the review entails, and how issues are followed up and resolved. So make these decisions during the planning phase and incorporate them into your agreement, and then make sure the relevant stakeholders, like the clinical trial manager, knows what the agreement says and what is expected. Then with respect to document review, obviously you're going to review and approve all the different study plans. And then you're also going to review, as suggested by the FDA, the monitoring visit reports. You're going to have access to the TMF. It's not just a repository. It's considered a live, living document in which you document your oversight of the trial. And by dipping it into it periodically, you should be able to see if it's been kept up to date and our documents being filed in a timely manner. The MHRA, they suggest that you keep an oversight file and perhaps add a tab to your TMF index, so then when you take the TMF back in-house at the end of the study, you add your documentation to that tab for the sponsor oversight. And both EMA and MHRA expect the TMF to always be current and inspection ready. And if you haven't already, or if you're not signed up for, it's worth signing up for the MHRA Inspectorate blog. They did 2 last year on sponsor oversight, and every time they post something new, they did one lately on electronic medical records and what you should be looking out for at sites that are using them. And they're always very helpful blog posts from the inspectors. So do sign up if you haven't already. So you want to plan ad hoc effectiveness checks of your oversight plans. You're going to document that. You may have to modify them if you see that something has come up, and look at what is working and what is not. Okay, most importantly, you want to prevent issues from arising. The most important tool for ensuring human subject protection and high quality data is a well-designed and articulated protocol. So before your protocol is finalized, you're going to seek input from the CRO partner that you're working with, any third-party vendors, clinical investigators, patient advocacy groups. They can all bring their collective experience to the table. For investigators and research coordinators, don't reach out just to the key opinion leaders who may only enroll 1 or 2 patients because everybody goes to them with their trials. Instead, speak to an investigator on the ground, as it were. Have them look at a draft protocol. For ER and ICU studies, as well as OR studies, consider visiting a site and walking through a potential enrollment so you have some sense of the huge number of people involved in caring for a study patient. And each caregiver's interaction with a study subject could potentially create a risk, whether it's by administering a medication that is contraindicated in the study or failing to alert the study team to a change in the patient's condition. Investigators can provide other insights which might impact recruitment. In one study that I worked on, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, their billing rules changed between when feasibility studies were done and when the study was ready to start. So feasibility suggested that a large number of patients would potentially be eligible for enrollment, but when the study finally started, there's a large number of patients failing screening. And then it took some time to become evident as the EDC was late going live, and then there was a bolus of data entry. But the long and short of it was the high screen failure rate was due to elevated ferritins. And that was because physician practice had changed at the site level, and patients now, instead of receiving Epogen, which is very expensive, the physicians had switched to iron, but that was causing their serum ferritin levels to be elevated. So that resulted in a protocol amendment, updates to EDC, and then delays in recruitment. But these are kind of things you need to, when you're designing your protocol, you need to be aware of what's going on with CMS, what other trials are out there competing for patients for the same indication. That you can get from clinicaltrials.gov, but you can do all of this homework beforehand. And then know your patient population. For example, one research coordinator posted in one of the forums I monitored about how at her site in an oncology trial, the patient was waiting close to a year for reimbursement of travel expenses from an academic site. So patients do share these experiences in patient forums. So, I mean, there's no reason why in this day and age, you couldn't be contracted with Greenfire, for example, to make patient reimbursement simple. Then with the dialysis population, which I'm also familiar with, for example, they dialyze Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday on 3 shifts. But what we used to see was that study subjects tended to be from Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and from the first and second shifts, so that the coordinator wouldn't have to come in on a Saturday or be there in the evening, or the sites didn't have the resources to get those patients. So a greater population was available if all the shifts and 6 days can be covered. So that's the kind of information when you're designing your protocol. Look at your patient population and just see if you understand the nuances and what might impact that recruitment for your trial. And that same population at an investigator meeting for a phase 3 study, the CRO demonstrated an ePRO device, and it was a handheld device with a small screen. And the investigators across the board said, this is not going to work because you have patients with poor eyesight and peripheral neuropathy, and they were going to have issues like tapping in the information that was required. And that trial, for a number of reasons, but it failed to recruit and was eventually terminated. And if you think about the amount of money that had been spent to get it to the phase 3, so really it pays to do your homework. And physicians also share their experience. At the FDA hearing in October about E8 implementation, an oncologist in the audience spoke about 4 competing trials for the same indication in the Washington, D.C. area. And he had no insight to the design of the trial and which might be a better experience for his patients. So he faced a dilemma. Does he refer the patient to the trial that is having trouble recruiting subjects? But why is it having trouble recruiting subjects? Maybe it's not a good experience for his patients. So physicians in the community want to be able to provide input as well. Then there was a recent BBC documentary, War in the Blood, about 2 of the first patients in the UK to receive CAR-T therapy for their leukemias. So if you have an opportunity to see it either on BBC America or if it's available on Amazon, I would urge you, anyone who's working in the research arena should watch this documentary. So the patients were followed for the duration of their treatment. Sadly, both of them died, but it did give the viewer insight on what trial participants endure by being first. And the bone marrow biopsies were particularly difficult to watch, even though the patients had, they had local anesthesia, but I mean, there were tears rolling down the face of one of them. He was only 18 years old. And I'm afraid that, yes, it was wonderful. These patients, they volunteered their time, and one of them hoped it might help other people, but it was very painful to watch, and I'm worried that things like that might deter patients from participating in research. So E8R1 requires patient input in the trial design. I mean, without patients, you don't have a trial. You want their study experience to be positive, that is not waiting for travel reimbursement. And with social media, you can't afford not to take their perspective into account. You don't want participation in your trial playing negatively in the media sphere. And also, you want to set your CRO partner up for success. So ask them about their prior experience in similar studies, what they have learned from it, and then listen to their advice. Don't wait until the protocol is finalized before sharing it. I love this quote from Albert Einstein: "Not everything that be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." It's tempting to measure too many things just because you can, and people tend to focus on timelines and budget, but not quality. First patient in, rush, EDC going live, etc. But meanwhile, it's going to cost you more on the back end to fix things if you don't take your time to do it right from the outset. So what are you going to measure? Well, when it comes to human subject protection and data integrity, your study endpoints, you're going to look at your key risk indicators, thresholds, and quality tolerance limits. Using the input of the medical team and the trial statistician, decide what you will measure and why. You want to be able to identify trends early on and take proactive measures. For the QTLs, generally you don't want to measure any more than 3 to 5. And for the KRIs, look across all functions and identify the key risks. For example, delayed data entry impacts real-time data analytics. So if you think about right first time, have you picked the right sites? Are there competing trials? So do your homework. And also solicit input from CRAs. They have direct experience on what's been issued for sites, so don't discount their inputs. And then when should you do that? During the planning phase of the trial with your risk assessment activities. Like I said, you don't want to wait until the protocol is finalized because you do want to set your CRO partner up for success. So now I have another polling question here. Your organization has a robust risk management program and monitors KRIs and QTLs, does not have a formal QMS system, but actively identifies risks and how they will be managed, outsources risk management activities, beg your pardon, would not know what a QTL is. Okay, well, it looks like, a little over the halfway, 50%, has a robust risk management program in place, which is great news, and everybody else is working on it, I would imagine. So, and if you do have a question about QTLs and CTQs is the next acronym on the horizon, critical to quality factors. Chrissy McDonald, one of my colleagues at Avoca, she's presenting a seminar in February on navigating risk and minding your CTQs and QTLs. So do consider registering for that. Okay, the next slide then is about using available technology. So you should have access to the systems being used by your vendor so that you can keep your finger on the pulse, as it were. You want to look at queries. Are the same ones coming up across sites? Is more training required? Who's being alerted when thresholds are being approached? Now we're seeing some eQMS systems, but each organization needs to determine its own unique needs before selecting a vendor and a system for QMS, as well as determining when to implement it and what to include, whether it's CAPAs, vendor qualification reports. And you do need senior management buy-in. It's often not realized until late in the game when you've got this huge amount of documentation that it's difficult to manage, but you need to have refined your processes before deciding on the technology. There's no point in having a system in place if people aren't going to use it. And that mantra, garbage in, garbage out, comes into effect there. So next is real-time management of risk. You want to ensure that your quality management agreement extends to the subcontractors of the CRO. The EMA, those inspectors will review those contracts and they want to see evidence of ongoing assessment. And what their expectations are is outlined in Annex 4, the EMA GCP Inspectors Working Group, and that you can download so that you have an idea of what to expect, because we are seeing more European inspectors conducting inspections in the US. So do be mindful that you need to be cognizant of what their expectations are. Testing a potential new drug in people for the first time is a key moment in drug development. Treatments, as you know, can have unpleasant side effects. Some may show up during treatment. Others may not show up until much later. So sponsors, they may plan to adapt the design based on early results. So they need data entered in close to real time if they're going to make those decisions. Lack of effectiveness is the most common reason why drugs fail, and they need to know sooner rather than later whether the investigational product is promising or not. It's very disappointing for all parties to get through a phase 3 and find that the data does not show efficacy. So keep all that in mind. You're constantly watching what's happening across the trial. You're looking for early signals in data that things may not be well, addressing it in real time. And the long and short of it is you want to be able to make decisions as this data accumulates and act on it. So this is just a high-level summary of risks that warrant oversight, and we're talking about providing oversight commensurate with the risk. For populations with chronic conditions, be mindful that SAEs may be underreported. Look across sites. If most are reporting 2 to 3 over a 6-month period and one site has none, ask why. Agree on a classification for deviations and what would be considered major and what needs to be escalated to you. You do all this in the planning phase. And then deviations should be captured not just in the site monitoring visit reports, but also in the central monitoring visit reports. Inspectors will want to know when you identified an issue and what did you do about it. How are deviations managed? What instructions were given to sites? Was it consistent across all sites? And a common finding for FDA is failure to follow the protocol and inadequate monitoring. And the GCP findings tend to be the same year after year. So those things that come up again and again in 483s, have them on your radar and then document your oversight. So to conclude, good vendor oversight is a combination of 3 things: tools, processes, and people. You want the right people doing the right thing, doing it right at the first time. It also means then that you want to select the right sites, so leverage data available from central IRBs. You want a well-designed protocol with good risk control, and hopefully with all of these things, you'll have no rework, no amendments, and that you can get your product to market sooner. And I would argue that people are the most important element, and your relationships with those people. If they do the right thing, they will always be inspection ready. Thank you. And we'll open it now for questions.
That was fantastic. So we have a lot of questions that have come in. I'm going to, I think, Lori, you're on the call, correct? You're going to be asking Bridget the questions?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So yes, we do have a lot of questions. I don't believe we're going to get through them all on this call. But as Kristen said at the beginning, we are going to respond to each and every question in a follow-up email. So if we don't get to your question today, be on the lookout for those responses in a few days. Okay, so my first question here for you, Bridget, is would you be able to share any R2 inspection experiences?
Okay. Well, you may or may not know, but at Avoca, they solicit sponsors' inspection experiences, and they haven't had any formal responses this year on R2 experiences. But anecdotally, I can tell you what I've heard from blog posts, from different presentations people have done, and then from my own network of people who've gone through things. So I can tell you, I have a little list here of what I've heard, which may be helpful. At a conference in November 2019 on risk-based monitoring, I believe it was held in Philadelphia, but the presenter there reported 5 inspections had been conducted across agencies since R2 went into effect. And of the 5 inspections, 3 of those sponsors had adopted R2 and 2 had not. And the findings for the 2 included a lack of protocol risk assessment, a lack of risk-based monitoring, and poor CRO oversight and specificity of duties. And just that the 3 sponsors who had adopted R2, they had their CRO partners present during the inspection, which I think is good because it is a collaboration and you are working on your risk management plan together. And an inspector at that presentation apparently commented that companies who are relying on 100% source data verification as a driver for quality are clearly indicating a lack of understanding of what clinical trial quality means. Then I heard of another inspection. This was an EMA inspection conducted in the US for a pediatric NDA. And again, this is just through my personal grapevine, but the inspector there wanted to know why no central monitoring had been conducted. And then a UK inspection, this I learned of at an RQA meeting, and at a UK inspection of a non-commercial sponsor, the inspector asked them how they arrived at the algorithm for source verification. And they weren't able to tell him because they had used an outside consultant to build their algorithm. And unfortunately for them, it was bad luck to get an inspector who was also a statistician who asked questions like that. And so that's just anecdotally what I've heard. I think we're going to be seeing more, by the time it went into effect, and depending on where people were in their cycle in with submissions, I think we're going to over the next few months see a lot more or hear a lot more feedback. And there is an upcoming symposium. It's a joint MHRA FDA symposium being held in London in February, and I think we're going to see more harmonization on the inspection approach, because the FDA approach has been a bit ad hoc, and lately certainly all the postings, all the 483s have been related to vaping manufacturers, which are not really what we're interested in. So I think we'll build our body of knowledge, and by attending these kind of things, and certainly I'm actually going to be dialing in for that symposium in London between MHRA and FDA, and any information that we learn, obviously we'll be sharing with our members.
Okay, great. Great answer, Bridget. Thank you for all that information. We have a few other questions that are related to vendor oversight for non-CROs, so clinical vendors like central labs, imaging vendors, ECOA, IRT, et cetera. What's your experience with oversight of these non-CRO vendors?
Well, it would depend. It depends on who they're contracted with. So if you're the sponsor and you're contracting directly with them, okay, so you are going to have to qualify them like you would qualify your CROs. You're going to have to qualify that vendor, and you want somebody who has that expertise, who's very familiar with those systems, who's done that kind of qualification before, and who can speak to what is needed. Remember, I mentioned about doing an internal risk assessment to see who has different kinds of industry experience, and if you don't have it in-house, you may have to contract with somebody who has that experience. And then when you've qualified them, you have, they've confirmed that their processes have all been validated, and then during the course of the study, you need to meet with them regularly, make sure that any issues are being addressed or being escalated appropriately, and then you need to periodically reevaluate them, because staff change, and not everything is always passed over. So you might have somebody new come in, wouldn't know the history of the trial or what the issues had been, and you need to make sure that there is that continuity and that the information is being disseminated to any new hires. And then you also want to see what their training processes are for new people that join on the team. You want to look at their SOPs, the same kind of things that you would do for a CRO. They're your vendor, and you're responsible for the quality of the data they're providing. So you need to make sure that they meet your expectations and that they continue to meet your expectations during the course of the study.
Okay, thanks. Another question here, Bridget. For what vendors is a quality agreement required or expected?
I would generally say that for your CRO, they're going to be, any of the CROs that you're working with, it's a good idea to put a quality agreement in place. Now, they're relatively new on the research scene, so not everybody may be familiar with them, but it is important that you set your expectations for quality from the outset, and I would encourage you to consider that. Putting that in place and setting your expectations right from the outset as to how you expect quality to be managed and risk to be managed during your study.
Okay. Looks like we're doing great with these questions. I'm going to give you another one. A few people have questioned if central monitoring is mandatory. They say that they understand that central or remote monitoring is an option as long as you have a risk assessment process. What can you tell us about that?
Now I'm just going to go back to my slide, so just bear with me here. I can see just I believe certainly with the FDA, they give you some flexibility in your approach, but the actual ICH guidance, just let me see what I have here it's section 5. Okay, let me see here. Okay. And this is language from the guidance, may use varied approaches to monitoring, for example, a combination of on-site and centralized monitoring. So if you don't do centralized monitoring, how are you going to know what's happening in real time? So yes, the expectation would be that you're monitoring the data centrally, and then if you see a trend or you identify an issue or you're seeing lots of protocol deviations, then you need to investigate and get a monitor out to the site, and maybe they have to do retraining. But I would say that you do need to be doing it, because otherwise, how do you know? How do you manage risk in real time if you're not looking at that data in real time? That's
Very
a rhetorical question. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Another question just came in, sort of following up on the non-CRO vendor question that I asked you a few moments ago. They're asking, what if the CRO holds the contract, but the sponsor is managing the vendor due to CRO lack of expertise?
Well, now let me think about that. So this is where we talked about your expertise. So when you're setting up your governance committee and you're looking to see who has what experience, and it may be obviously the CRO, they're doing studies all the time with different indications. They may have the expertise and they may be providing the oversight, or in this case, as you're talking about, they're a subcontractor of the CRO, but in this case, you're the sponsor and you have that expertise in-house. So either ways, you're responsible for the quality of the data. As a sponsor, you're always responsible. So you may just, you may want to make it, like, for example, a three-way agreement so that you can, or have the CRO modify their agreement to make it explicit that oversight is going to be provided by the sponsor. But it's not a bad thing. I mean, the main thing is that ultimately, as the sponsor, you're responsible. But when it comes to how the contract is structured, you might want to make it either a three-way or do some kind of separate addendum, as it were, between the sponsor and the third-party vendor.
Okay. Now, a few people have asked if you could tell us the name of the documentary that you mentioned during the webinar today?
Yes. It's called War in the Blood. And it is...
Can you repeat that?
War in the Blood, WAR, War in the Blood.
War in the Blood. Okay.
Yeah. And it was. I mean, and I work in research, so you know, it was as I expected. But my husband, who was watching this at the same time, was totally freaked out by the biopsies, and I don't think he'll ever participate in a clinical trial. You know, even though what was nice at the end of the documentary, I mean, it was very sad, and they showed the funerals, and but then they posted pictures of other participants in the trial, and you know how long they were in remission. This one's been in remission 6 months. This has been in remission 16 months. You know, so they did give information on how the other patients. It was a phase 1 trial. How the other patients were doing, but that was at the very end, you know, when the credits were going up, as it were. So if you hadn't stuck with it, you wouldn't know that yes, some of these patients really did benefit from the trial.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned the term or the acronym CTQ on the webinar. Can you say what that stands for and maybe give us a little bit more information?
Yes, CTQ is critical to quality, and that is an acronym that is used in E8, very much in E8 that's coming out in June, and they actually have an appendix to E8 indicating what they consider in a schedule of events, for example, what they consider to be critical to quality, and informed consent obviously would be one of those things. And then blinding, double blind studies, whenever there's blinding, that, you know, there's always the risk that, you know, you may inadvertently unblind somebody. So that's the CTQs, and critical to quality factors are the focus of, and quality by design are the focus of the E8, you know, the E8, ICH E8 Revision 1 guidance, which is coming into effect in June. They expect it will come into effect in June 2020. Now, they might roll it out in Europe before the FDA adopts it. Last time around was about a 2-year lag there for ICH E6 or 2. But on the ICH website, they have under, you know, the efficacy guidelines, if you go to the efficacy guidelines and look at E8 or 1, they have a nice PowerPoint summary of what the changes are to that guidance. In fact, for all of the efficacy guidelines, if you go on to E6, you'll see the proposal document for E6 or 3. So that way you kind of know what's coming down the pike.
Okay, great. And also, can you also repeat what you shared at the beginning of the webinar about Chrissy McDonald's upcoming presentation on CTQs and QTLs?
Actually, that's I believe Kristen at the end was going to talk about various other upcoming presentations, and that's an Avoca presentation. Actually, I can forward the slide, can't I? Because then it's right at the end.
I can just talk to that. So that is another webinar that we're doing on February 18th, same time frame. And that's going to be on when navigating risk in clinical trials, it's best to mind your CTQs and QTLs. So a lot of the questions are coming in are on those topics. So I would recommend definitely attending that webinar. It's another free webinar, and we'll be sending information out to everyone about that so you can sign up.
Do we have time for another question or two, Kristen?
We do.
Okay, great. All right, so Bridget, does ICH GCP specifically say a sponsor is responsible for reviewing all monitoring visit reports?
No, it doesn't. So you have to demonstrate your oversight, okay? And if you've outsourced monitoring, you need to put a plan in place of how you are going to provide oversight, as it were. And one example is reviewing monitoring reports. But I mean, obviously, depending on the size of the study, it wouldn't be practical or a good use of your time to be reviewing every single monitoring report. But certainly when there's a change in CRA, you set your expectations at the beginning. You might do an annotated monitoring visit report of what you expect to see where on the document, and that issues they identify and how they're escalated. And then after that, you might decide to just look at a selection. But if there's a change in monitor at a site, obviously, or if there's a change in team members anyway, you want to look and see what training they've had, and then I would certainly look at the first couple of reports to see that it meets your expectations. And then as part of your monitoring plan and part of your vendor oversight plan, you would indicate how you plan to conduct that. And it may be that you decide that you're going to do some co-monitoring visits or CRA assessment visits. Don't necessarily call them co-monitoring visits, but what you're doing is you're going out to see how that monitor is conducting her visit at the site, and how she's doing her documentation, how she's instructing the coordinator, what her interactions are with the investigator. You do want to see, they're representing you, so you do want to see how they're interacting with the investigator. So you may want to consider over the course of the study doing some on-site assessment visits, as it were, and then you can solicit feedback from the investigator as well. Are his questions being answered in a timely manner? Does he know who to call if he has protocol questions, that kind of thing.
Okay. On slide 16, if you could go back to that slide for us, please, Bridget. You mentioned governance charter templates. And some of our participants are asking if they have access to these templates.
If you're an Avoca member, yes, there are charter templates available through the Knowledge Center.
Great. And I think that, do you want to do one more question, Lori, and then we'll conclude?
All right. This should be a quick one. Bridget, do you recommend an audit to each vendor before working with them?
Well, yes, I would recommend a qualification audit, a vendor qualification audit. And obviously, if you've worked with them in the past and there hasn't been a change in personnel and you're familiar with their processes, then no, I wouldn't necessarily do another one. But if they are a new vendor, yes, absolutely, I would say that you should do a vendor qualification audit.
Excellent. All right, well, we're getting a lot of really good feedback, and we have a lot of extra questions that have been asked. And as we mentioned before, we are definitely going to compile all those and make sure that everyone gets the answers that they need. But I do want to go ahead and say thank you to Bridget and Lori and everyone at the Avoca Group. This was a fantastic webinar. As we mentioned before, in the next day or so, you will receive an email from them that will include the slides as well as the recorded version and some information on the upcoming events that we mentioned. I want to also thank everyone who's in attendance. And really thank you for your time and your engagement. We had some excellent questions that came in. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.